This very important resolution, of which I am very proud to be one of the co-sponsors, and especially for your trip, along with other members of the House, but you led it, to India, to be at the side of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in this hour of terrible suffering for the Tibetan people. Madam Speaker, tonight we are here to speak frankly about what the Chinese government is doing in Tibet. Last week, Lodi Gary, His Holiness's special envoy, told me and others on the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that Tibet has, quote, become a particularly in the last few weeks, in every sense, an occupied nation, brutally occupied by armed forces. Madam Speaker, despite the fact that there's an extensive news blackout, the grim consequences have gotten out. Chinese soldiers and police have shot large numbers of people. The death toll is now well over 150. We don't have any idea how many have been wounded, how many are right now lying wounded or dying in attics and cellars, because they know that if they go to the hospital, they will simply disappear into the Chinese laogai. The Chinese government has been subjecting Tibetans to mass arrests. They have searched whole sections of cities, house by house. Chinese officials admit to nearly 2,000 arrests. The China Commission estimates that there are at least 1,000 more. Frankly, I wonder if there might be thousands more, since there are large areas of Tibet from which nothing has been heard from in weeks, where phone lines and cell towers and emails have been simply turned off. Many thousands of monks are now being held under house arrest or in lockdown. Chinese riot police have surrounded some Buddhist monasteries and are letting no one get in and no one gets out. Many have been tortured. I would remind my colleagues that we're seeing now in a massive way what has been ongoing and pervasive for decades. I chaired a hearing in 1995, Madam Speaker. We heard from 6 survivors of the laogai. One of those was Palden Gyatso, a Tibetan monk who spent 24 years in prison. When we invited him to come and speak, he brought with him some of the instruments of torture that are routinely employed and used in a horrific manner against men and women in the Chinese concentration camps. He told us that many people die of starvation. But when he brought those instruments, he couldn't even get through our Capitol Police. They stopped him. We had to come down and get him through. And then when he held up those batons that are used in the mouth and elsewhere in order to provide electric shocks, he actually broke down. He held it up and he said, "This is what went into my mouth as a Buddhist monk and into the mouths of many other people to shock and to deface," and he has trouble swallowing to this day. He talked about these self-tightening handcuffs and held up his wrists and showed us the marks that were on his body, not just on his wrists, but elsewhere. He talked about piercing with bayonets, and this is routine. I would encourage members to realize what goes on each and every day, but now in a more pronounced way, in a more massive way, against the people of Tibet through the use of torture. The Chinese government, Madam Speaker, what they are doing right now is exactly what happened in some other parts of the world from the communists. And who can forget the Soviet invasion of Hungary that was still felt on the streets of Budapest in the 1980s, even though that happened back in 1956. Tibet is now a cruel place, not the people, the Chinese imposition of their law and of their crackdown. Madam Speaker, it should be noted and emphasized that the Tibetan people have not provoked the government into this newest wave of repression. It is the Chinese government that has provoked the Tibetan people to protest, a protest that, perhaps because of the Buddhist emphasis on peace, has been overwhelmingly peaceful. As we all know, Tibet has been subjected to Chinese communist tyranny since 1951. Since 1959, the Chinese government is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Tibetans, and that is a low estimate. The current number of Tibetans living in China is now about 5.4 million people. I think members should realize, too, that there's also been, and the Dalai Lama speaks about this when he speaks about his 5 points of engagement, and that is this population transfer, where the entire culture is being replaced by Han Chinese who are getting very good jobs, and the incentive has been placed there by the Chinese government to marginalize and decrease the Tibetan people, to make them more of a minority in their own land. What we're talking about here is nothing less than a planned destruction of a culture that has now gone to new lows with this recent crackdown. In fact, the Chinese government its attitude toward Tibet, can be seen in these two insults by Zhang Jingli, the secretary of the Communist Party of the Tibet Autonomous Region, who offered to the people these rules. He said, "The Communist Party is like the parent to the Tibetan people and is always considerate about what the children need." We're talking about a very abusive parent here. And he also said, "The Central Party Committee is the real Buddha for Tibetans." What a sacrilege! What a sacrilege! What a violation of fundamental human rights. I will say only a couple of words about the Olympics, Madam Speaker. The IOC made a great mistake in allowing China to host the Olympics. Who can forget when they were vying for it for the 2000 Olympics? And they let Wei Jingsheng out, and Speaker Pelosi knows him very well. I met him in Beijing when he was let out, very briefly. As soon as they didn't get the Olympics, they rearrested him and beat him and tortured him. And then they finally let him out because he was close to death. But then they rewarded the Olympic venue to Beijing several years later. They shouldn't be held in a nation that cracks down on all kinds of political dissent and has a system of coercion where brothers and sisters are illegal as part of its one-child per couple policy, its forced abortion policy, and also a country that is responsible for killing so many Africans. The most recent is happening in Darfur, and this really is, as my colleague Ms. Lee said earlier, the genocide Olympics. That repression and those killing fields are ongoing today in Darfur. And as we all know, some 4 million people died in southern Sudan even before that. And it was the Chinese enabling of that killing fields as well. Finally, let me just say briefly to my colleagues that there are many American companies who may be supporting this tyranny. I'm afraid some of them are doing that, playing smaller or larger roles in the crushing of Tibet, working with the Chinese Internet Surveillance Bureau to block websites and blocking and tracking down Tibetans who send Internet reports of arrests and massacres. The New York Times has reported that the Chinese government is indeed, not unexpectedly, blocking websites to prevent uncensored news from reaching the Chinese people, including websites of CNN, BBC, YouTube, Google, and Yahoo. The Times has also reported that the Chinese Internet Surveillance Bureau has warned Tibetans about sharing factual news about the protests. They have said, and I quote them, this is the Chinese Bureau, "We inform Internet users that it is forbidden to post news about Tibet events. The Internet Surveillance Bureau will carry out filtering and censorship. Anyone infringing this ban will have their IP addresses sent to the police, who will then take the necessary steps," close quote. That means, Madam Speaker, arrest. That means, Madam Speaker, torture of those who simply try to share the truth as to what is going on in Tibet. Who can forget Shirtao, the journalist who got 10 years simply for sending information to an NGO in New York about what the Chinese Bureau of Propaganda had told them they could not do with regards to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now it's going on in Tibet, and the ugly cycle continues. As I think members know, the Global Online Freedom Act legislation that's pending and hopefully will come to the floor would finally give us a full and thorough accounting as to this complicity, whether it be witting or unwitting, on the part of these Internet companies, so that we are not part of this tyrannical regime that is now so brutally suppressing, murdering, torturing, and killing Tibetan people, and putting so many monks into prison rather than in their monasteries where they want to practice their faith. Madam Speaker, this is an excellent resolution you brought to the floor. I congratulate you. This is bipartisanship, I believe, at its best. We are all in support of the Dalai Lama. You have led on this for so many years and are doing so now as Speaker, and I hope we get a very strong support on behalf of the Tibetan people and on behalf of the Dalai Lama. I yield back the balance of our time.